So in the previous session, we learned about what exactly is TestNG and what is its purpose. We also understood how we can install TestNG, in the sense how we can add the TestNG plugin, the TestNG dependency into our code, and we saw how we can execute it, right? And then we actually use the @test annotation and assertions concept. Okay. We also understood that this annotation is nothing but a label, right? So you specifically tell your program that the next few lines of the code are basically a test case altogether, right? Moving on, coming to today's particular agenda, we'll first look at how we can write a failure test case, where we'll also look at how we can add priority when we are working with multiple test cases. Okay. Next, we'll talk about some more annotations like @before method, @after method, and so on and so forth. And finally, we'll look into an interesting concept called as the data provider. Okay, right? So in the previous session, we basically tested the login page of the Nexttrend's e-commerce application using the correct credentials, right? And we also know that when you're testing a login functionality, there are multiple cases that come into picture, right? One could be the success case where the username and the password, both of them are correct, right? The success case is something that we have tested out. Okay. Then there are failure cases like correct username, wrong password, wrong username, correct password, both username and password are wrong, and so on and so forth, right? There could be many such cases altogether. Okay. So for the scope of this particular session, what we'll do is we'll take one such failure case and we'll test the login page functionality with that. Okay. So let's say we want to test a case where the username is correct, but the password is not correct. Okay. So let's try this out. All right. So there we go. So here we are in our application. So let's say if it's the correct username and password, Rahul and Rahul @2021, we'll be successfully navigating to the home page. That is something that we already know, right? Let's say we give the username as correct, which is Rahul, and instead of password being Rahul @2021, we'll deliberately give a wrong password. Rather than giving @2021, we'll just give 2021. Okay, and we'll just click on login over here. And here you can see that the username and password did not match. There's a small error message that says the username and password did not match. All right. So this is basically something that we are expecting. Okay. So for the sake of it, let's just, inspect it and see what exactly is the class name of it. All right. So we'll just right click on it, click on inspect. And here you can see that it's a paragraph type element where the class name is error-message. Okay. Which says star username and password did not match. All right. So that is how we are going to look at it. And this is the error message that we are looking for. Okay. So we'll just quickly close this and get back to our session. All right. So basically what we have done is we are able to see how exactly the failure test case looks like when we manually try it out. Okay. So let's move on and try to automate the same thing altogether. Okay. So as usual, we have provided you with the initial code in the reading material. Okay. All you have to do is download the code and open it with your IDE and make sure that you have updated the path to the Chrome driver. Okay, right. Another important note about this particular code that we have provided is you will be able to observe that there's a new section called as build in the pom.xml file where you might see a new piece of code. Okay, so what happens over here is by default, Maven uses a Java version based on several factors, a variety of factors, including environment settings, installed JDKs, its own internal defaults, and so on and so forth, right? However, this might not always match the specific Java version that our project's dependencies require. Okay, so we basically bring in a lot of dependencies and start working with them, right? So in such situations, what happens is we'll have to add a new plugin to our pom.xml file. Okay, so we can clearly specify which Java version we are looking for, what we can use to compile our project, and so on and so forth, right? So this basically ensures consistency and compatibility with our project's dependencies across various environments altogether. Okay, right? So let's take a look at the code that we have imported. So yeah, as you can see over here, this is the code that we have imported. Okay, I've gone ahead and actually configured my the Chrome driver to my system's path. Okay, right, and this is where you will be able to see all the import statements and all. Okay, so if you run this particular code, we should be able to see the test case being successfully executed. Okay, so let's take a look at it. All right, so we are able to actually see that the test case has run successfully. We can see the entire reports over here. Another interesting thing is the left side part. Okay, so here you can see we have something called as a default suite, and then there is first test, login page test, login with valid credentials. This basically is the order of test cases that we have written, and because we have only one test case at the moment, we are only able to see one test case over here, right? So you can also execute your code with using the play button over here. As you can see, for login page test, we have a green color play button. Okay, so you can click on it to run the test altogether, right? And similarly, as we have discussed, here you will be able to see a new piece of code called under build, where we have actually configured a new plugin altogether, right? So this is something that is needed for consistency and compatibility sake. Okay, you need not worry about it at all. Okay, let's get back. So similarly, to test the login page with failure cases, we will need to add a failure method in the login page test Java file, right? And as for every case, we'll add the @test annotation here as well. Okay, so let's say we call this particular test case as login with invalid credentials. Okay, right? And inside this, the test scenario steps will still be the same, right? We'll first define the location of the Chrome driver for the specific scope of this particular test case. Okay, and then we'll ask our Chrome driver to navigate to the required web page. In this case, it's the login page, right? Then we'll locate the username element and then send the username to it. Then we'll locate the password element and send the password to it. But because we are trying to work on that login page with a failure case, we'll be sending a wrong password over here, right? That is, instead of sending the correct password, which is Rahul@2021 in this particular scenario, we'll remove the @ over here and send a wrong password to it. Okay, then finally we'll look at the login button with the identified value. Okay, and then we'll try to use the submit method on it. Okay, right? So let's just quickly try it out. All right, so let me just minimize this part, and let's just minimize this part as well. Let's say we want to write a new test case altogether. Let me just collapse this part as well so that it will be easily readable. Okay, right? So all we need to do is we'll write @. We need to have a new test case where it's public void. And instead of login with valid credentials, we're going with login with invalid credentials. Okay, so we'll write login with invalid credentials, right? Brackets and flower brackets over here. Inside this, we're going to write our test case, and because obviously we are going to run the same steps, I'll just simply copy this part all the way from setting the WebDriver location, initializing the WebDriver, to identifying username elements until login button element altogether, right? So I've copied this, Control-C. I'll just quickly collapse this again, and inside this login with invalid credentials, we should be able to see this entire new code altogether. Okay, so let's just give it a try. Let's see what happens when the submit button is clicked. Okay, right? So we'll just run the code from here. All right, so as said, you can also click on the green color play button over here. All right, so the first test case is executed, and we'll just quickly close it. All right, so as you can see, we have not modified the password over here, right? So let's just modify the password. We'll give it a wrong password now. All right, so we'll just run this particular test case again. We'll just click on run. So as you can see over here, we have given a username and password, and the username and password did not match. We see an error message over here. Okay, so this basically means our initial steps for this particular scenario have been executed successfully, right? So let me just quickly minimize this part, and let's get back. All right, now if you think about it, in the successful test case, the entire website loads and we are able to test if the home page is opened or not using the URL comparison mechanism, right? Now the question is, in the case of failure cases, how do we validate if the test case that we have written has been executed correctly or not? Just think about it. We have observed that there's a red color error message over here that pops up when we give the wrong inputs, right? So we can use that. And instead of comparing the URLs, we can check if the error message element is visible or not. And as we know, sometimes the elements take some time to load. So what we'll do is we'll add a wait mechanism to ask our program to wait until the error message element is visible. Okay, and then we'll just locate the element, and then we'll get the visible text from it. And finally, we'll use the assertions to verify the actual result matched or not. Okay, and as usual, we'll write the driver.close method over here. Okay, so let's try this out. All right, so here we are in the code, and basically we have understood that there's a red color error message over here, right? So let's say we see it over here, as we can see in the website. So when we gave the wrong username and wrong password, we get a red color error message over here, right? So if you right click on it and click on inspect, we can see that the class name is error-message. Okay, keep this in mind. All right, so here we are in the IDE. Okay, so all we need to do is what we have basically done is we have basically selected all the relevant elements, sent the relevant data to it. Now it's time to check whether it's the test is running correctly or not. Okay, so for that we'll basically ask our program to wait until, or else we wait for the error message to load. All right, so we'll ask it to wait for the error message to load, and then we'll use the WebDriver wait class over here. We'll call a new instance of wait where we'll just give it the new WebDriver wait of. Here we'll basically ask our driver to wait for a duration of 10 seconds, right? So we'll just write driver comma, and here we'll mention the duration of seconds where it will be 10 seconds. All right, then we'll just ask our program to wait until a particular expected conditions are matched. And what is it? We want the error message to be visible. All right, so we'll just use the visibility of element located. Here we can see over here, right? So visibility of element located, how we want to identify it using the class name. And what is the class name? We have seen that it's error hyphen message, right? So here we'll simply write error hyphen message. Okay, so if you want, you can actually go to the browser and then inspect it as well, right? Let's do it once. All right, so here we are. We can see this error message over here. Just quickly inspect on it, and here we can see that the class is error hyphen message. So we'll just quickly close this off and we'll be back to the IDE. Okay, right. So what we have done is we have asked our program to wait for a while so that we can actually wait until the error message element is loaded. Okay, so what's the next step? We just need to grab this particular visible text from it. Okay, so we'll just write web element. We'll use the web element class, and let's call it the error message element equal to. Here we'll just quickly use our driver to find an element by its class name, and the class name is error hyphen message. All right, so we need to make sure that this is clearly written. Okay, so then we'll use the string this thing, and then we'll write string space error message, okay, equal to, we'll use this error message element to get the text of it. All right, so finally what we have done is we have basically come over here and we have grabbed the text that is visible from this particular element. Okay, and all we need to do finally is we need to check, we need to validate if our test case has run correctly or not by using assertions. Okay, and then we'll close the browser instance altogether, right? So all we need to do is we'll write assert equals of this error message that we have grabbed the text from, and in the double quotes we'll just copy this particular string. Let's just copy this particular string over here and we'll just paste it over here, saying that the username and password didn't match. If this particular string matches, then it means that our test case has been executed successfully, right? And then we'll simply write driver.quit. All right, so we'll just quickly write driver.quit and save it. All right, you need to be very, very careful when you're running these test cases. So if at all you run a single test case, you'll be able to run a single test case, or if you want to run both the test cases all together, you can either click on this button or directly go here and click on this play button altogether, right? So we'll just what we'll do is we'll just click on this run login page test. So let's just all right, so let me just cancel this part, and here we can see. So what I've basically done is I have gone over here, right? So I've gone over here and clicked on the play button, right? So this is how you can run the test. And here you can see two browser windows popped up because we are running two test cases over here, right? So here we can see that login with invalid credentials and login with valid credentials, both of them have executed. Okay, right? And when you scroll down over here, here also you'll be able to see the relevant summary of the tests altogether. We have run two tests, both of the tests have passed, and so on and so forth. Okay, right? So we have login with invalid credentials and login with valid credentials. Let me just quickly collapse this, and here you can see we have login with invalid credentials at the second place and login with valid credentials as the first test case altogether. Okay, so let's get back. Okay, now if we could basically see that both our test cases have passed. The successful login test case has passed, the failure login test case have also been executed as expected, and we got the corresponding report as well. Now, did you observe that the failure method is executing first, right? That is, while running the test cases, you might have noticed that the failure function is executed before actually running the successful test case part, right? Why do you think that happened? You see, there's a thing with Selenium. The reason is that these test methods are executed in the default alphabetical order. Okay, so when you think about it, so we have login with invalid credentials, there's an I over here, and then login with valid credentials, there's a V over here. Alphabetically, I comes before V, which is why the failure test case will be executed first, right? And because the failures method name basically comes before the successful test case, that is how it got executed. Okay, now the question is, how do we resolve this execution order issue so that our successful login test case runs first and then with the failure test case altogether, right? To do that, we have something called as a priority attribute in TestNG. Okay, and using this particular priority attribute, what we can do is we can set the priority order and then we can control the sequence in which the test methods are executed. Okay, right? So basically what happens over here is we'll be setting the priority of a particular test case so that we are basically telling our program that you should run this particular test case first and the next one next and so on and so forth. Okay, so basically the priority order allows us to define the execution sequence in a nutshell. Okay, and the syntax is something like this. We'll write @test notation, and with that we'll give the brackets, we'll use the priority attribute, and then we'll mention the value over here. Okay, right? So the priority values are by default integers, okay, where the lower number indicates the higher priority. Okay, so let's say if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, the priority number 1 will be executed first and so on and so forth, right? So fundamentally what you need to understand over here is the test methods with lower priority values are executed before the ones with higher priority values. Okay, right? So the test method with the same priority are executed in the order that they are written. Okay, by default test methods, if you don't mention any kind of priority value, they are assigned a default priority of 0, and the value 0 is the lowest of all the possibilities, right? So which is why it will be executed at the first. Okay, now using this particular concept, we can actually define the entire execution order of our test case like the ones that we have written. Okay, all we'll have to do is add a brackets beside the @test annotation and then set the priority value. Okay, for example, in this case we are setting the priority of the successful login test case as 1. Okay, and here we are setting the priority as 2 for the failure login test case, which is the invalid credentials part. Okay, now when we run this, we should be able to see that the valid credentials test case would be executed first because the logic is lower number will be executed first. Okay, right? Let's give it a try. All right, so here we are. So now all we need to do is we'll just add brackets over here, and this is where we need to mention or use the priority attribute, right? As simple as that. So we'll write priority equal to 1 over here, and then same with here, we'll just write the priority equal to 2 over here. All right, so this is where we basically tell our program that you should execute so and so test case first and the next one next and so on and so forth, right? So as usual, we'll just save this code and then I'll click over here. And as you can see, the login with valid credentials, the valid credentials part has executed first because we have given the priority as 1, and then login with invalid credentials has executed next because we have given it the priority 2. Okay, right? So this is how you can actually prioritize the order of test cases, the order of execution in your IDE altogether, right? When you're actually automation testing using Selenium. Okay, so let's get back. Okay, so as we have observed, the test cases were executed in the order of priority. Okay, moving on, if you observe both the test methods, we can actually notice that they contain certain repetitive code segments, right? Like the browser setup, creating an instance of the browser, then navigating to the login page, then closing the browser at the end of the month method, right? So all of these things are basically repetitive in nature. Okay, and here's how they look like. Like if you see, before we actually start testing, the common steps are setting up the property of the browser. We'll tell it the path, then we'll create a new instance, then we'll ask it to navigate to the web page, right? And once the test completed, finally what will happen, we'll close our browser. That's a common step, right? And this is common for both the successful and the failed login case as well, right? In fact, we can handle this code redundancy also. So basically, to eliminate the code redundancy and to better organize our test code, TestNG also provides specific annotations like before method, after method, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's try to understand what they are. So the before method, or the @before method and @after method annotations, they are used to define the pre-test and post-test actions that need to be performed before and after each test method execution. Okay, that is, in simple terms, using these annotations, we can tell our program what actions we need to perform before each and every test method, and then what action should be done after each and every test case. Okay, right? So taking the @before method annotation, it is used to annotate a method that should be executed before each test method within a particular test class. Okay, it typically is used to set up the initial conditions or the prerequisites that are required for the testing. Okay, right? Moreover, this method is is run once before every test method in the class. That is, it is used to initialize the variables. You can open a browser, establish a database connection, perform any kind of setup operation, and the moment you write @before method over there, it basically would be executed every time newly for a new test case altogether. That is, every time we want to run a particular test case, this particular thing ensures a clean and consistent state before we start executing each and every test altogether, right? So moving on, an important thing to remember or note over here is that when you're working with these annotations, the definition of things matters a lot. Okay, for example, in the case of the code that is commonly executed in the beginning of each test case, so what are we doing? We are basically defining an instance of the WebDriver, and the scope is limited to that particular test case only, right? But when we move the initialization to a different scope altogether, we'll have to define it publicly, that is in a global scope. Okay, for that we'll simply write public WebDriver driver. Instead of defining it locally, we'll define it globally altogether, right? Before defining anything else, this is something that we have to do. Okay, now in general, to be able to use these annotations, we'll need to import them first, right? So we'll write the corresponding import statement as well. Okay, so let's try this out. All right, so here we are in our IDE. All right, so what we'll do is we'll write public, right, and then we'll just define the WebDriver. Right, so WebDriver, and we'll call it the driver over here. Okay, so we have defined it globally, so we don't need to define it locally altogether, right? So what we'll do is we'll just quickly remove the WebDriver from each of them. We'll just delete this part. Driver equal to something. Here this is done, and in this one, login with invalid credentials, we are also removing the WebDriver part again. We'll just delete this, save the code, and now, so what do we need to do? We need to use the @before method part. Okay, for that, the primary step is to import these relevant things. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go to the import section, and here we'll just simply quickly import the @before method annotation. Okay, so we'll write import org.testng.annotations. Here we are going to mention the before method. Okay, so before method, we'll give it a semicolon over here, delete the extra spaces. Okay, now what's the next step? We know that there are certain pieces of code, certain lines of code that we need to execute before each and every test case, right? For that, all we need to do is we need to define, or we need to specifically write the before method over here. So we'll write @before method, and let's call this particular method as public void, and let's call it setup. Okay, so setup is just basically a generic statement. You can actually configure or modify this particular statement as anything else. Okay, so now what we need to do, we need to take the commonly executed steps and put them into this before method. Okay, so if you take a look at the login with valid credentials part, this is a common part. System.setProperty, we are assigning a new Chrome driver to the driver variable, and then we are asking it to go or navigate to this particular page, right? It is the same with the login with invalid credentials part as well, right? So there's not much of a difference. So what we'll do is we'll move this particular piece of code over here. Public void setup is something that we are going to run, and from here in each of these test cases, let me just delete this part. Okay, so in each of the test cases, we don't need this particular statement anymore, right? So we'll just remove this from each of the test case, right? So we'll just select these 3 lines and delete. All right, so now what has happened? We have used these common statements into the @before method, and this is where we are going to run the common statements, which are basically setting up the WebDriver instance altogether, right? So let's add it as a common. So setting up the WebDriver instance. Right, so this is the piece of code that sets up the WebDriver instance altogether. Okay, now all we have to do is we have basically removed the common code. Okay, now then we just need to execute our code altogether, right? So we'll just save this code, click on the run button over here, and then let's see what happens. All right, so both our test cases executed as expected. Let me just collapse this part, and then we have the login web page test, we have the before method, we have the first test, we have the second test altogether. And as you can see, the login with valid credentials, login with invalid credentials, both of them have executed as expected. Okay, right? So let's get back. All right, now what have we observed? We saw how the before method actually executed the first set of lines freshly for each and every test case, right? And the method name setup is commonly used as a common convention for the before method annotation. Okay, but it's not mandatory to use this specific method. You can choose any kind of name that is descriptive and meaningful for our test setup altogether, right? Okay, now let's look at the after method annotation. Basically, just like before method, it is used to annotate a method that should be executed after each and every test method within a test class. Okay, so it's typically used to perform cleanup or tear down operations after the execution of the test method. Okay, so this method, which is annotated after method, it runs once after every test method in the class. Okay, it can be used, for example, to close browser windows, release the resources, delete temporary files, or whatever it is, right? So similar to the case of before method annotation, we'll need to import the necessary information, and then we'll need to run our code. Okay, and in our case, we'll simply move the driver.close method from our test cases into this particular annotation, right? And once done, our code should look something like this in terms of the structure. We'll have the public WebDriver driver, the public description, and then we'll have the before method, first test case, second test case, and the after method altogether. Okay, so let's give it a try. All right, so here we are, and so all we need to do is simply import the necessary annotations. So we'll just write import org TestNG annotations. This time it will be after method. Okay, so we'll just write the semicolon over here, and as you see we have the before method over here. We'll just quickly remove an extra space. We'll write @after method. Okay, and here let's call this particular function as the teardown function. Okay, so we'll write a public void, and then we'll call it the teardown method. Right, so once again this is a variable. You can actually change it according to your requirement. Okay, so we'll basically write the code for closing the WebDriver instance. All right, so what is the code for this one? We'll just need to copy this particular part, this driver.quit part. We'll just cut it and make sure that you don't miss out on any semicolons, and we'll just paste it over here. Right, so we'll remove this particular statement from the first test case also. We'll just remove this driver.quit part. Okay, we'll just quickly save it. And then what we'll do is we'll save the code. We'll just collapse this particular part as well so that the readability is good enough. Okay, so as you can see over here, we have the relevant import statements. We have the main method in which we have publicly defined, the globally defined the WebDriver, and then we have the first before method, then the first test, then the second test, and finally the after method, which gets executed after each and every test case altogether. Right, okay, so all we need to do is simply run this code. So we'll just click on this play button or the run button, and let's see what happens. All right, so as you can see over here, we have the login with valid credentials, login with invalid credentials. Both the test cases have been executed. And if you have observed, implicitly, the before method and after method sections have been executed for each and every test case altogether, right? Okay, so let's get back. Okay, so we have successfully able to run the required test using the annotations. Moving on, in this case, the method teardown is commonly used as a convention for the @after method annotations. Okay, however, it's not mandatory to use this specific method name. You can choose any method name that is descriptive and meaningful for our operations altogether. Right, now so far we have tested the login page using a single set of credentials. Okay, so let's expand our testing scenario by examining or testing the login page with different credentials. Okay, so but fundamentally, why should we check the login data with different values? That's the fundamental question, right? So this is done to test the login page with various sets of data to ensure the robustness of our login page mechanism. Okay, so when you give different data, it will help you identify any kind of potential issues or potential vulnerabilities and ensure that they are handled correctly. Okay, right, and when it comes to TestNG, there are 4 main ways to provide data to the test methods. Okay, you can either use the @DataProvider annotation, okay, which will supply the test data from a separate method to our test class. Okay, you can also use the @parameters to pass test data directly from the testing.xml file. Okay, or you can use the external sources like reading the test data from Excel, CSV files, databases, JSON files, and so on and so forth. Then there is the hard coding test data part where we directly use data within the test methods and so on and so forth, right? And if you have observed, so far we have been using the fourth approach, right? So we have hard coded the test data where we are saying username.send keys of Rahul, username or password.send keys of Rahul at 2021, and so on and so forth. We are basically hard coding the test data, right? We are directly using the test data within the test methods. Okay, now what we'll do is let's see how we can use the data provider @DataProvider annotation. Okay, basically if you look at it, this data provider feature or annotation or approach, whatever you want to call it, this particular feature in TestNG, it allows us to supply multiple sets of test data to a particular test method. Okay, and before we even start using it, let's first understand the syntax of the data provider in detail. Okay, so there are 2 approaches available to use the data provider annotation, right? So we can either create a method that returns a 2-dimensional array or object array, right? Like it looks something like this: object space, 2 sets of square brackets, and so on and so forth, right? Or we can create a method that returns an iterator of an object array, like iterator, object, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we already know what is a 2-dimensional array or a 2D array, right? And how we can work with it is also something that we know. Okay, so we'll choose the first approach in this particular case, where we'll create a method that returns a 2-dimensional object array, right? And there are 4 steps to do that. So firstly, we'll have to define the data provider method. Okay, then we'll return the test data as a 2-dimensional object array, and then we'll use the data provider in the test methods, and finally we'll test the logic using the provided data, right? In that, the first step is to actually define a data provider method in our test class. Okay, right? So this is how you'll do that. The syntax for that will look something like this. So we'll write public space object, then 2 sets of square brackets to denote a 2D array, and then let's call it the login data method. Okay, right? And then this particular data provided method should be annotated with the corresponding label or the corresponding annotation. In this case, it's @data provider. Okay, and for that we will, as usual, we'll import the corresponding classes. We'll write import org TestNG annotations data provider and so on and so forth, right? And the next step, inside the data provider method, we should return the test data as a 2-dimensional object array, right? And the code for that will look something like this. We'll write return new object Pranita at 2021, Rahul at 2021, and so on and so forth, right? So here each row in the array represents a set of data for one test execution. Okay, and similarly each element in the row represents a parameter in the test method. Okay, so let's update our code until here. All right, so here we are in our code. So basically we need to import the data provider library or the class. So what we'll do is we'll just add some new lines over here. We'll write import org.testng annotations, and this is where we'll use the data provider method, right? So we'll import the annotation over here, and then what's the next step? We need to be able to use data provider method. Okay, right? So after this particular before method is done, we'll just add a new data provider method over here, right? So we'll write at the rate data provider. Okay, and here we'll define a two-dimensional object array, right? So we'll write public let's call it object. Okay, and here we'll have two-dimensional array over here where the array's name would be login data, right? So you can name it anything that you want, but for now, because it's most descriptive and it's understandable, we'll just write it over here, right? So don't forget to add the semicolon over here so that it gets balanced out. Okay, right? So what we'll do is we'll just define our data, right? So we just need to return a new object with multiple pieces of information, right? So we'll write return. Okay, so we'll just write a new object over here where we'll have multiple sets of data, wherein we'll simply write so under this new object we'll have two new sets, right? So inside this we'll write maybe let's say the username is Pranita. Okay, and the password is maybe let's say Pranita at the rate 2021. Let's make sure that we give it the right quotes. Okay, so we'll write Pranita at the rate 2021. Okay, so this is one thing, and then we have in double quotes we have Rahul, and we'll give it as double quotes Rahul at the rate 2021. Okay, right? So this is how we have defined it. Okay, so let's just give a semicolon over here, and then we'll balance it out over here. Right, so all we have done is we have effectively executed, or we have effectively defined the data provider method over here, right? So we have imported the relevant annotation, then we have annotated this particular method, defined a 2D array, two-dimensional array called as login data, inside which we are returning a two-dimensional array object, right? So we'll just quickly save this, and then let's get back. All right, so now that we have defined our data provider, we just need to use it in the test methods, right? For that, we can use the @test annotation and specify the data provider attribute. Okay, all we need to do is we'll provide the data provider method name as the value of the attribute. Okay, and when added, it will look something like this. We need to first add the data provider attribute in the test annotation. Okay, then we'll need to add the required arguments to the test case methods. Okay, and finally, we'll run our test cases with the corresponding provided data. Basically, in the test method, we can access the test data using method parameters. Okay, and each parameter in the test method should correspond to the elements in the data set provided by the data provider. Okay, that means we'll have the arguments called as string username, string password in the test case method definition, right? We'll have to mention the same arguments in the send keys methods as well. Okay, right? So let's try this out. All right, so all we need to do over here is, let's say we only want to add the data provider part in our login with valid credentials method only. Okay, so we only want to check out this particular test case. So in addition to mentioning priority equal to 1, we'll write data provider equal to, in this we'll just mention the login data as the name. Okay, so we'll write login data. Okay, right? So this is how we are going to mention it. And then what will happen over here is we'll have to update the login with valid credentials test case with the relevant parameters or arguments. Okay, so here we'll write string username, comma, string password. Okay, so this is how we'll give it. We'll save it. Okay, now what will happen is, because we have defined this username and password over here, instead of directly hard coding the values, we'll just give it as parameters. Okay, right? So we'll just give username over here, and then we'll just remove the hard coded password, and we'll give password over here. Right, so we'll save this. Okay, so what's the next step? We have understood that. Let's just quickly recap what we have done right now. Okay, so we have imported the data provider annotation. Okay, and then defined the data provider method in which we have given two sets of data, one Pranita, the second one for Rahul, and so on and so forth. Right, so we'll just quickly save this, and what we have done is we have used the data provider attribute along with the name of this particular method. Okay, and then what we have done is we have given these things as arguments, string username, string password as argument, and we are using the same things over here instead of hard coding the actual values. Okay, so let's save this. Let me just quickly collapse these things so that it will be easy for us to see the entire structure. Okay, so yeah, here we are. So first of all, we have defined the WebDriver publicly, then we have the before method, then the data provider comes into picture, then the first test case runs, and the second, and so on and so forth. Right, so let's just quickly run it and see what happens. All right, so as you have observed, we have seen three different pop-ups of the browser windows, right? So this is basically because in the data provider method, we have defined two sets of usernames and password, two sets of credentials altogether, which is why the first case of login with valid credentials was tested with Pranita and Pranita at the rate 2021. The second case was Rahul and Rahul at the rate 2021. Now let's say if we had mentioned 10 different sets of usernames and password, it'll have run 10 different times altogether. Okay, right? So let's get back. All right, so we have seen three different test cases altogether. First success case for Pranita's credentials, the first set of credentials in the data provider method. Then we have seen